For a long time, I thought experience would bring certainty, that years lived would naturally turn confusion into clarity. But what it actually brought was a deeper awareness of how little control I ever had. With time, I didn't lose questions. I learned which ones no longer needed answers, and that shift felt both unsettling and quietly relieving. I notice now how much energy I once spent proving myself, explaining choices, defending direction, as if life were something that required constant justification. Somewhere along the way, urgency softened, not because everything was resolved, but because I began to recognize the cost of carrying unresolved tension everywhere I went. There's a different relationship with time that comes with age, not rushed, not passive, but observant, aware that moments don't repeat themselves and don't ask to be optimized. I've learned how easily the mind returns to old regrets or imagined futures, how tempting it is to measure the present against what could have been, but also how grounding it feels to stay with what remains. Slowing down isn't a loss of relevance, it's an adjustment of attention, a way of noticing details that were invisible when everything moved faster. I'm more aware now of what drains me, what steadies me, what no longer deserves the same reaction it once did. There's a quiet strength in no longer needing to be understood, in allowing life to be imperfect without immediately correcting it. I don't feel finished, but I feel less compelled to arrive somewhere else. And in that steadiness, there's an understanding that meaning doesn't come from accumulation, but from presence, from staying with each moment as it unfolds, without rushing it into the past or the future. As the years pass, I've noticed that life becomes less about adding and more about subtracting, not in loss, but in refinement. There was a time when I believed growth meant constant expansion, more goals, more explanations, more effort to stay relevant and engaged. But gradually, I began to see how much noise that created inside me. With experience comes a quieter awareness of limits, not as restrictions, but as boundaries that protect what matters. I find myself less interested in proving strength and more attentive to where I place my energy, more aware of which conversations feel nourishing and which ones leave me depleted. Time has a way of revealing patterns that once felt personal but now appear universal. Cycles of striving, hesitation, and release that repeat until they're understood rather than resisted. I've learned that not every reaction deserves the same intensity it once did, and that choosing calm isn't avoidance but discernment. There's a subtle dignity in allowing opinions to pass without defense, and letting silence speak when words no longer add clarity. I notice how my relationship with ambition has changed, how purpose feels less like a destination and more like alignment with the present moment. The future still exists, but it no longer pulls with the same urgency, and the past feels more like a reference than a weight. I don't feel finished or resolved, but I feel more grounded in what remains when expectations fall away, and that groundedness carries a depth I couldn't have accessed earlier in life. At some point, I realized that time doesn't actually answer questions, it changes the way you hold them. What once felt urgent now feels distant, not because it mattered less, but because I no longer need resolution in the same way. There was a phase of life where everything felt like a test, where choices carried pressure and mistakes felt permanent, and I moved through those years trying to secure a future that always seemed just slightly ahead of me. With age came an unexpected shift, not toward certainty, but toward acceptance of complexity. I notice now how rarely life fits into clear narratives, how often meaning reveals itself only in hindsight, long after the moment has passed. There's a quieter relationship with ambition that develops over time, one that's less about achievement and more about sustainability, about asking what can be carried without strain. I've become more attentive to my limits, not as signs of decline, but as signals of wisdom, reminders that energy is finite and attention deserves intention. The past no longer feels like something to fix, but something to acknowledge, a collection of moments that shaped me without defining me entirely. I'm more comfortable leaving some things unresolved, allowing unanswered questions to exist without turning them into problems. There's a subtle peace in understanding that not every chapter needs explanation, that some experiences are complete simply because they were lived. I don't feel detached from life, but more grounded in it, less compelled to rush, less afraid of pauses. And in that steadiness, I recognize that maturity isn't about having fewer doubts, but about carrying them with less resistance, letting life unfold without demanding it conform to expectations I once believed were necessary. There comes a stage in life when you begin to notice how little of it was actually about the events themselves and how much was shaped by the meaning you assigned to them at the time. I look back now and see how strongly I reacted to things that no longer hold the same weight, how convinced I was that certain outcomes would define me forever. With distance, those moments soften, not because they were insignificant, but because perspective changes the scale of importance. I've learned that disappointment doesn't disappear with age, but it loses its sharpness, becoming something you can hold without being consumed by it. There's a growing awareness of how often I once tried to control timing, people, and outcomes, believing that vigilance was the same as responsibility. Over time, that effort revealed its limits, and with that realization came a quieter way of moving through life. I'm less inclined now to chase closure, more willing to let experiences remain unresolved without turning them into unfinished business. Silence feels less threatening than it once did, pauses less like gaps and more like space to breathe. I notice how my priorities have narrowed, not from lack of interest, but from clarity, a clearer sense of what deserves attention and what can be released without regret. There's a subtle confidence in no longer needing every moment to be productive, every choice to be justified, every feeling to be explained. I don't experience life as simpler, but as less demanding, less insistent on being understood immediately. And in that shift, I find a steadiness that doesn't rely on certainty, a way of being present that accepts change without rushing to resist it, allowing time to move at its own pace while I remain attentive to what is quietly unfolding. As life progresses, I've noticed how memory changes shape, how certain moments grow quieter while others return with unexpected clarity, not to demand attention, but to be acknowledged. There was a time when I tried to make sense of everything that happened, believing that understanding the past would somehow secure the future. But over time, that effort softened. I no longer feel the same urgency to explain every decision I made or to resolve every regret into a lesson. Instead, there's an acceptance that some choices were made with the awareness I had then, not the perspective I carry now. I see how easily self-judgment filled the gaps where compassion was needed, how often I measured myself against imagined alternatives rather than lived experience. With age comes a quieter kindness toward myself, not indulgence, but fairness, an understanding that growth is uneven and rarely linear. I'm more aware now of the weight of expectations I once carried, expectations about success, stability, and meaning, and how naturally some of them fell away when they stopped serving me. Time hasn't erased loss or disappointment, but it has changed how they live inside me, less as wounds and more as reminders of what mattered. I don't feel detached from ambition, but I relate to it differently, less as a measure of worth and more as a direction I can choose or release. There's a calm in recognizing that life doesn't need to be summarized or justified to be valid, that presence itself carries enough meaning without constant evaluation. And as I remain with that understanding, I sense a deeper appreciation for what remains, not as something to hold on to tightly, but as something to be experienced fully while it's here. Over time, I've come to see how much of my life was shaped by responsibility, not just the practical kind, but the unspoken sense of duty I carried toward roles, expectations, and identities I once believed I had to maintain. For years, I measured myself by how well I endured, how reliably I showed up, how little I allowed my own needs to interfere with what was required of me. That discipline brought structure, but it also taught me to overlook subtle signs of misalignment, moments when obligation quietly replaced choice. With age, I've begun to recognize the difference between commitment that sustains and commitment that slowly depletes. There's a quiet relief in admitting that being dependable doesn't require self-erasure, that responsibility can coexist with honesty. I notice now how often I once pushed through fatigue without questioning whether it was necessary, how easily I justified imbalance as maturity. Time has given me a clearer sense of proportion and understanding that not every demand carries the same weight, that discernment is as important as effort. I'm less reactive to pressure now, more willing to pause before agreeing, to listen inwardly before responding outwardly. There's a steadiness that comes from allowing roles to evolve rather than clinging to them out of habit. I don't feel less capable because of this shift, but more grounded, less driven by fear of letting others down, and more guided by clarity about what I can offer without losing myself. In that balance, responsibility feels less like a burden and more like a conscious choice, one that respects both the world I engage with and the inner life I continue to cultivate. At a certain point in life, you begin to notice how much of your energy was spent resisting change rather than responding to it, holding on to familiar patterns because they once provided stability, even when they no longer reflected who you were becoming. I remember believing that adaptation meant failure, that letting go of old identities or ambitions somehow diminished the effort I had already invested. With time, that belief softened, and I started to see how change doesn't erase meaning, it reshapes it. There's a quiet humility in acknowledging that some dreams were fulfilled simply by being pursued, even if they didn't unfold as imagined. I'm more aware now of how fear can disguise itself as loyalty to the past, how easily nostalgia convinces you that what was familiar was also right. Aging brings a different relationship with loss, one that isn't always dramatic, but persistent, woven into transitions you don't notice until you look back. I've learned that letting go isn't an event, it's a gradual reorientation, a willingness to stop forcing continuity where it no longer fits. The future feels less like something to secure and more like something to meet with openness, without demanding guarantees. I don't feel detached from who I once was, but I'm no longer defined by that version either. There's a growing comfort in allowing life to shift directions without interpreting it as deviation. And in that acceptance, I find a steadiness that comes not from holding on, but from trusting my ability to adapt with awareness, carrying forward what still matters while releasing what has quietly completed its purpose. With time, I've become more aware of silence, not as absence, but as something textured, something that holds more than noise ever did. There was a period when I filled every gap with activity, conversation, or thought, believing that stillness meant stagnation or withdrawal. Now, silence feels different, less like emptiness and more like a space where life can be felt without interpretation. I notice how many decisions were once driven by the need to stay engaged, to remain visible, to confirm my place in the world through constant movement. Age has softened that impulse, not into indifference, but into selectivity, a clearer sense of when participation adds meaning and when it only adds weight. I've learned how restorative it can be to let moments pass without commentary, to observe rather than immediately respond. There's a subtle recalibration that happens when you stop narrating your life and simply experience it, when awareness replaces explanation. I'm more comfortable now with pauses in conversation, with unanswered messages, with days that leave no tangible trace of productivity. These moments no longer feel wasted, they feel inhabited. Time has taught me that presence doesn't require intensity, and that depth often reveals itself quietly. I don't seek silence to escape the world, but to meet it more honestly, without the noise of expectation or performance. In that stillness, I sense a deeper connection to what remains constant beneath change, an understanding that life continues to unfold whether or not I fill every moment, and that allowing space can be as meaningful as taking action. As I look at life now, I no longer see it as something to complete or resolve, but as something to remain present within, even as it continues to change. There's a clarity that comes not from answers, but from acceptance, an understanding that many things once pursued with urgency were never meant to be secured, only experienced. I notice how the pressure to define myself has gradually faded, replaced by a quieter awareness of who I am when I'm not trying to be anything in particular. Time has stripped away certain illusions, not cruelly but patiently, revealing how little certainty was ever required to live meaningfully. I feel less inclined to judge past versions of myself, more willing to acknowledge that each phase carried its own form of truth. There's a gentleness in realizing that life doesn't demand perfection or constant progress, only attention. I'm more attuned now to the subtle rhythms of my days, the way moments arrive and pass without asking for explanation. The future no longer feels like a destination that must be reached correctly, but a continuation of presence, shaped by choices made with awareness rather than fear. I don't feel finished, and I don't need to be. There's a steady confidence in allowing life to unfold without constant correction, in trusting that meaning emerges naturally when resistance softens. And as I remain here, attentive and open, I sense that fulfillment isn't found at the end of striving, but in the quiet recognition that this moment, exactly as it is, has always been enough.